Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
During Grandma's 80th birthday, they handed out gift bags to every cousin except me. The moment I realized what was happening, it was as if someone had taken a needle and pricked the air out of the room, at least for me. I had been standing near the cake table, balancing a flimsy plastic cup of punch, when I watched my aunt, with her wide, exaggerated smile, call each cousin by name. One by one, my cousins, 15 of them, some I barely spoke to, lined up, laughing and giggling, each receiving a glossy little bag with tissue paper spilling out like streamers. Every time she handed one over, there was a comment, "You'll love this," or "This is just perfect for you." My name, though, never left her lips. I remember the exact moment when my youngest cousin, Sarah, no older than 12, clutched her bag like it was a crown jewel and ran past me, giggling about the lip gloss inside. My aunt walked right past me, bag in hand, looked me dead in the eye, and then turned away to hand it to the next person. That second of eye contact was deliberate, not an accident, and I felt my stomach drop the way it does when you miss the last step on the stairs. It wasn't about a gift bag. It was about what it represented. Every dismissal, every subtle reminder that I didn't belong in the golden circle of favorites my aunt had spent years curating. I forced a smile so stiff it made my cheeks ache. My mother caught my eye from across the room, and she looked away quickly, as if embarrassed for me but unwilling to intervene. My father busied himself near the dessert table, pretending to arrange plates. Grandma, radiant in a soft lavender dress, sat in the middle of it all like a queen, unaware of the politics swirling around her. She was too busy smiling at the flowers, the balloons, the cameras flashing in her direction. She never noticed the quiet way I folded into the background, trying not to make a scene. When the last bag was handed out, applause filled the room, and someone shouted, "Group photo." My cousins, bags in hand, clustered together, all bright smiles and matching tissue paper sticking out like feathers. My aunt pushed me toward the group, even though I had nothing in my hands. She said, "Come on, Emily, don't be shy." I stood in the back row, smiling faintly, my hands awkwardly folded in front of me, painfully aware of the emptiness. The camera clicked. I knew in that moment that the photo captured more than faces. It captured the truth of who was valued and who was not. After the picture, I slipped out quietly, murmuring something about needing fresh air. No one tried to stop me. My heels clicked across the hall floor, each step sharper than the last, until I pushed open the heavy glass doors and let the night air hit me. It was cold, crisp, a little damp from earlier rain. I stood there for a long minute, clutching my phone, replaying the scene in my head. My cheeks were still hot from forcing that fake smile, my throat tight from holding back words that wanted to burst out. But instead of breaking down, I laughed. A sharp, hollow laugh that startled me with how bitter it sounded. Because what else could I do? Confront them? Beg for equal treatment? No, that would give them the satisfaction of seeing me wounded. They had handed me the perfect opportunity, and I wasn't going to waste it. I leaned against my car, opened my camera roll, and looked at the group photo. 15 cousins grinning, holding their bags high like trophies. Me, the lone one in the corner, empty-handed, half a smile frozen on my face. The contrast was brutal, undeniable. I zoomed in on myself, cropped it just right, and already my fingers itched to type. As I drove away, the party fading in my rearview mirror, my phone buzzed with notifications, friends liking the earlier photos I had posted of Grandma blowing out her candles. It would be so easy, I thought, to slide one more picture into that stream, one that told the story they never intended to be seen. And not with anger or accusation, but with the kind of humor that cut sharper than rage. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or messy, it's quiet, undeniable, and public. By the time I reached the edge of town, headlights flickering past me on the dark road, I had the caption already forming in my head. I didn't even need to write much. The image would do most of the talking. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the adrenaline mix with satisfaction. They wanted to make me invisible in that room, but I was about to make them unforgettable everywhere else. When I pulled into my driveway, the caption was written, polished, and saved to drafts. I sat there in the dark, the glow of the screen lighting my face, reading it again and again. One photo, one sentence, that was all it would take. I could already imagine the ripple spreading through family group chats, text messages buzzing between cousins, the frantic attempts to explain. I hit save, leaned back, and smiled for real this time. By the time I stepped out of the car and shut the door, I wasn't just the cousin they had ignored. I was the one holding the story in my hands. And the night wasn't over yet. I did not walk straight into the kitchen and collapse the way a smaller version of me might have done years ago when the family's polite little knives landed under the ribs, because tonight the air felt different, like a corridor where all the doors were finally unlocked. So I set my purse down, toed off the shoes that had pretended to be comfortable, and opened my phone to the draft with the photo where 15 cousins clutched coordinated bags like party favors from a theme park ride while I stood at the edge of the frame with hands empty and a smile you could hang a coat on, and I let myself linger there for a beat, not to wallow, but to choose the tone with care, because if revenge is going to arrive dressed in daylight, it ought to be pressed and tailored, not thrown together in the dark. The caption came out in one slow pour, the kind you get from a bottle you saved too long because you were waiting for an occasion that never had the decency to show up, and it read, "When love is handed out by the bag, it turns out mine was back-ordered. Don't worry." I brought my own hands, which sounded like a joke until you saw the photo, then sounded like testimony, and because I am not a monster, I did not tag grandma or the venue or the bakery or the church page that posted every potluck. Since the dawn of dial-up, I just posted to my feed and to my story, set the privacy to friends of friends, and put the phone face down on the counter as if that could slow the fuse I had just lit. The screen buzzed once, then again, then in a small, steady rhythm that turned the countertop into a patient with a nervous heartbeat, and because curiosity is not only a cat killer, but also a reasonable survival tool. I flipped it over and watched the comments stack. Old classmates who remembered my aunt's tidy brand of favoritism from back when school fundraisers involved who got invited to the VIP carpool line. A neighbor who typed that she hoped there was a misunderstanding, but that the picture did not look like one. My friend Lila, who simply wrote oof in a way that felt like a hug through gritted teeth, and then the cousins began to appear like prairie dogs popping up out of their carefully manicured holes, first with soft shoe deflections. Must have been a mix-up, you should have said something, we didn't realize you didn't get one, and then with the kind of half-apologies that carry more eye-roll than remorse, which would have been funny if it hadn't been so predictable. I let them talk, because silence can be a megaphone if you hold it the right way, and meanwhile in the family group chat, which I keep muted like an air conditioner that rattles too loudly at night, the messages started to flash across the top of my screen. Most of them not addressed to me at all but to each other. A frantic scurry of who posted what. Did you see the caption? Call your mother. Don't engage. She wants attention, which made me laugh out loud because if I had wanted attention at the party, I would have brought a drumline, not a pair of empty hands. What I did do, because humor is a blade you can butter bread with before you slice, was upload a second slide to my story. Not the group photo this time, but a close-up crop of the table where the remaining bags sat in a neat little herd. And I added a single line of text in a clean font that said, "Inventory complete, nothing else," and I watched the view count rocket upward as if I had just posted a puppy or a celebrity sighting, except the celebrity was the truth and it was wearing a paper handle. The first call came from my mother, whose default mode is to smooth, bless her heart, and she spoke in that soft, urgent voice she uses when the church ladies are within earshot, telling me she knew it looked bad, but surely it was an oversight. That grandma's hands were shaking and she did not need this on her night, that my aunt had meant well, and I answered with the kind of calm that makes people nervous, explaining that I had not named anyone, had not accused anyone, had not even asked for a bag, that I had simply posted a photo of my own face and my own hands, and if the room looked guilty, maybe it was because the room had practiced for years, and my mother sighed the way a balloon sighs when you loosen your grip for a second, and then she said, "Please, at least stop for tonight," which would have been compelling if tonight had not been the first time in a long time I felt like I was not standing in a corner holding someone else's coat. While we were on the phone, a direct message came in from a cousin who has never in her life sent me anything but forwarded recipes, and it said she hadn't realized I was excluded. which is an interesting claim from a person who stood 3 feet away during the distribution and cheered like a stadium announcer, and another message arrived from a woman I did not know well but who grew up with my aunt, saying, "This has always been her thing. It's just the first time someone showed the whole picture," and that one I screenshotted for myself, not to share, not yet, but to remember how it felt to be corroborated. The call I expected least came next, because my aunt does not cry. She leaks anger through a smile. Yet there she was, voice wet, insisting that my post had humiliated her, that people were messaging her church friends, that it was cruel to do this to family, that if I had an issue I should have come to her privately, and I let her finish her speech, then told her I had come privately for years and the door had always been locked, and that tonight I had not even knocked, I had just walked down a different hallway where the lights were on. For the record, I did end the conversation with something that counts as kindness in my book and also qualifies as revenge in a way so tidy it could wear a bow. Because I told her I would be happy to post an update clarifying that the bag situation had been a simple oversight and that a replacement bag had already been offered, and then I paused long enough for her to jump on the offer with grateful relief. After which I asked her, gently, to please confirm when she had actually sent that offer, and what exactly would be inside so my clarification could be accurate, and the silence that followed was not long, but it was revealing, and when she finally said she would figure something out, I thanked her sweetly and hung up, then opened my story and added a final card for the night that said, "Update pending. Family working on inventory reconciliation," which sounded dull in a corporate way that made people laugh, and also made one point very clear without naming a single person. By evening's end, the view count had tripled, the comments had developed their own weather system, my aunt had moved from tears to clipped messages about decorum, and my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. An older man from my grandfather's circle who had been at the party but mostly stayed near the punch bowl, and his voicemail, which I played twice to be sure I heard it right, said he had a story about how this favor system started and that if I was going to keep posting I might want the whole history, not just the picture on the surface, which I suppose is one way to say that the night was not over, not by a long shot. Morning did not arrive like a reset button so much as a second camera angle on the same scene, and while the comment sections were still busy rehearsing their roles, peacemaker, contrarian, amateur detective, cousin who suddenly discovered selective amnesia, I drove to the small diner near the river because the older man from my grandfather's circle, the one whose voicemail hinted at a backstory with more dust than polish, had suggested we meet somewhere simple where coffee could arrive without politicking and stories could be told without an audience that needed to be charmed. And the waitress with a name tag older than me slid a mug across the table while he settled his hat on the seat beside him and began to talk in a voice that carried the soft scrape of gravel. The kind of voice that remembers the price of gas from before I was born and the way my grandfather laughed with his whole chest. He told me that when we were children there had been a ritual that was almost sacred in its predictability. That every Christmas and every milestone birthday my grandfather would line up identical white envelopes and write each grandchild's name in the same patient block letters so that no one's could be read as more important or more practiced than the others. And inside each envelope there would be a modest savings bond or a small check with the exact same number of zeros, and the joy had never come from the amount but from the sameness, from the way fairness could be a warm coat you slipped into together. Then, after my grandfather died, the envelopes did not vanish immediately, but they changed their shape. The sameness eroded into merit, which conveniently meant that the loudest or most obliging or most photogenic cousins began to receive a little more shine, a little more substance, while those of us who did not orbit the preferred sun were nudged toward the shade within. Apology disguised as logic. He said there had been a ledger, a floral-bound thing with brittle pages, where my grandmother, organized to the bone even when grief turned the world into wet clay, kept a tidy list of names and dates and amounts so no one would be slighted even by accident. And when the ledger began to pass through other hands, the tidy columns apparently learned to tilt, and I felt, as he spoke, the memory unspool of standing in the hallway as a teenager and watching my aunt tuck a pastel notebook into the top of the hall closet behind the winter scarves, telling me it was for safekeeping, a phrase that now clanged like a pot lid dropped in a quiet kitchen. I thanked him for the truth, which tasted like aspirin, bitter, necessary, oddly clarifying, and I called my mother in the parking lot with the car idling, asked her straight if the ledger existed and who had it now. And after a pause long enough for me to count 3 breaths, she said that the book was in my aunt's possession because she had taken over the tradition, which is a pretty way of saying the bank changed owners without changing addresses. And then my mother did the thing she always does when the water gets choppy and suggested we all meet and talk this through like adults, as if the years of small cuts were going to politely rise and introduce themselves at a conference table. What I did instead, because my form of adult conversation involves receipts of the emotional kind, was choose a photograph from an old backup album on my phone. A shot from a childhood party where all of us cousins sat on the floor in paper crowns scissored from the same roll, frosting on our fingers and no idea yet how hierarchy grows quietly like mold in the corners, and I posted it with a caption that said, "Back when the only tears in this family were on the cake," which carried the exact weight I wanted. Nostalgia for anyone innocent, discomfort for anyone complicit, and a little humor for the rest of us who learned to laugh with our teeth together. Then I muted the post and let it travel on its own legs. Because nothing outruns a memory people recognize in their own houses. Within an hour, acquaintances who had never engaged with my life beyond holiday likes began to comment in that careful, coded way adults use when they are politely pointing at a fire alarm. This hits. Remember when fairness was a thing? My family had a ledger too, and guess where it ended up? And at nearly the same moment my aunt texted a message that tried to braid together 3 incompatible ideas, that she was heartbroken, that I had misunderstood everything, and that if I cared about my grandmother I would remove the posts immediately because people are talking, and I wrote her back with a kindness that had teeth, telling her I would be glad to post a correction and even an apology if she would send me a photo of the ledger page for last night and confirm the inventory policy in writing, because accuracy matters when one is auditing nostalgia. She did not answer that request, but my grandmother did call, her voice softer than I have ever heard it, as if someone had lowered the volume on everything in her world, and she asked me if I could come by that evening, alone if possible. Because there were things she wanted to explain without a telephone wire turning them into rumor, and because love is a complicated ledger of its own, I said yes, I would come, and after I hung up I added a small story slide that said, "Visiting the historian tonight," which made people laugh without turning the knife. Then, because petty can be purposeful when it's pointed at the right wall, I drove to a copy shop and printed the childhood photo along with my caption and slipped both into a simple frame. A private prop for a conversation that suddenly felt like it would either open a door or confirm that it had been bricked over years ago. Before I left the house, though, I allowed myself one more small, tidy act of revenge, the kind that looks like grace until you notice the design, and I created a shared digital album titled Grandma at 80, Equal Slices, invited every cousin and my aunt, and specified that each person who posted a photo should include a 1-sentence memory of a time someone in the family made them feel included when they expected to be left out, which is the sort of assignment that reveals a lot even when participants try not to say anything at all. I pressed send, watched the invitation icons travel outward, and felt the shift that happens when the room realizes the mirror has been moved to a place where it can no longer be ignored. At dusk, I parked in front of my grandmother's house where the porch light clicked on automatically, that small domestic lighthouse welcoming ships regardless of their cargo. And as I stepped onto the path, my phone buzzed with a notification that an item had been added to the new album by Administrator, a title my aunt gives herself the way a cat appoints itself governor of the sunny windowsill. And the thumbnail that blinked onto my screen was not a smile or a balloon or a slice of cake, but a scan of a ledger page with my name faintly missing from a column that pretended to be straight, a caption beneath it that read, "Work in progress," and although I did not know whether it was an accident or a dare, I knew my evening had just been promoted from conversation to discovery. My grandmother opened the door before my knuckles met the wood, as if she had been standing just inside the foyer rehearsing the choreography of welcome. And she drew me into the familiar hallway where the framed school portraits of cousins aged in uneven increments along the wall like rings in a tree trunk, each one a reminder that time had been generous to some and merely polite to others. And when we reached the living room, she motioned for me to sit on the sofa that still gave off a faint whisper of the lemon polish she swore by, then perched on the ottoman opposite as if a smaller distance between us might make the next part easier. Her hands stacked in her lap in that tidy way she does when she is deciding whether to tell the truth or the prettier cousin of it. She said my name in the careful tone she reserves for recipes and bad news, and told me that the ledger had always been meant as an anchor, a small private promise that no child would look across the room and measure their place with a ruler of envy. Yet after my grandfather died and the calendar kept insisting on parties and baptisms and graduations, as if grief were simply a thing you could file and forget, her sister, my aunt, though she did not say the word at first, offered to help with the details, by which she meant the arithmetic and the shopping and the lists that multiply when families do, and that she had taken the ledger home, temporarily, to keep it safe from kitchen spills and grandkids with crayons. Then discovered that safety could be a kind of power if you let it settle in your lap long enough, because soon the neat columns learned to tilt, and her justifications came phrased like compliments, that this cousin had worked so hard, that cousin was going through a tough season, that fairness should be flexible if it was going to be kind, and my grandmother admitted that in her old-fashioned arithmetic kindness and fairness had always been synonyms, so she did not see the slope until it was slick. When she paused to breathe, I placed the framed childhood photo on the coffee table the way a notary places a document between two pens, and I watched the memory travel across her face as she looked from paper crowns to sticky fingers to the caption I had printed beneath, and she smiled with an ache tucked into it, then asked if I wanted tea or something stronger. And I told her tea would be perfect if we could drink it strong enough to peel paint, and she laughed in that small way people laugh when their throat is already busy, and for a moment we were two women conspirators rather than granddaughter and matriarch, standing in the same room facing the same uncomfortable geometry. I asked about the scan in the album, the ledger page with my name not merely absent but erased in a way careful enough to be insulting, and she said she had not posted it, that she does not scan or upload anything except recipes for banana bread, which meant my aunt had entered the shared space I designed for celebration carrying a piece of evidence dressed as administrative transparency, and whether it was arrogance or a miscalculation or the casual confidence of someone who has never been challenged, the effect was the same, because now every cousin had seen the bones of the system under its party dress, and once bones are visible it is rude to pretend you are admiring the buttons. We drank our tea while the house ticked the way old houses do when dusk collects in the corners, and she asked, not as a command but as a favor, whether I could redirect the storm so it did not bend toward her, because she was tired and her bones liked quiet. And I told her that I would never embarrass her for sport, that my point had never been to carve her into the story as a villain, that the target was a pattern, not a person, and then I asked for permission to move the target in plain sight, with precision and with a little humor that would allow the truth to pass without breaking furniture, and she nodded in that small decisive way that has always been her version of a signature. After which she reached into the end table drawer and pulled out a ring with keys, thin silver birds that had not flown in years, and handed them to me for the hall closet upstairs, the one that had allegedly kept scarves safe and evidently kept records safer. I climbed the carpeted stairs that had witnessed birthdays and arguments and 1,000 quiet reconciliations, opened the closet to its familiar mothball perfume, and found on the top shelf a pastel notebook whose cheerful flowers felt like sarcasm, along with 2 white envelopes thick in the middle the way envelopes are only when they contain something other than letters, and I carried them downstairs without ceremony, set them between us, and let my grandmother decide which to open first, and when we unfolded the notebook, I found pages of careful entries in my aunt's handwriting that began as ledgers and slowly morphed into commentary, little evaluations of cousins' needs and merit, a vocabulary of distribution that read less like family and more like a grant committee without oversight. while one envelope held receipts that matched her generosity to favorite vendors and photographers, and the other held a thin stack of uncashed checks made out to me from years when I had apparently been too busy or not present to receive them, a story I do not recall being told, though here was the choreography in ink. There are moments when anger hammers on the door with both fists, and there are moments when it takes off its shoes and sits on the floor quietly while you decide how to feed it, and I chose the second, because the first would have satisfied no one except the part of me that enjoys volume. So instead I opened my phone to the shared album and, with my grandmother watching, I posted a new image. A photograph of the lemon-dusted coffee table with the framed childhood picture at its center. The pastel notebook blurred in the background just enough to look like a rumor, and a caption that read, "Tonight's flavor is restoration. Slices will be equal." And then I added a link to a simple form I built in 5 minutes. Nothing elaborate. Just a way for each cousin to submit a memory they would like honored at the next family gathering and to indicate a charitable cause in Grandma's name they believed deserved a matching gift, which I pledged quietly, in print and in front of her, to fund evenly. For every submission received, not because I am a saint, but because sometimes revenge tastes best when folded into generosity that cannot be redirected by a private clerk. The reactions arrived with the speed of gossip catching fire, cousins posting their memories with earnestness that made my eyes sting, neighbors chiming in with stories of my grandmother's insistence on splitting pies and checks and blame, and my aunt, who had been silent for an hour, finally texted me a message with a photo attached I could not immediately place, a picture of a receipt with a number that would have paid for a small parade and a note that said, "You do not understand the costs of maintaining tradition," which is an interesting phrase to send while standing next to a closet where tradition looks a lot like amended math, and while I tried to decide whether to answer with a paragraph or with the quiet of a well-placed period. My grandmother's landline rang with the kind of insistence that tells you someone on the other end is already crying, and when my aunt's voice spilled into the room promising to fix the ledger by morning, I looked at the keys on the table, then at the uncashed checks, then at my grandmother's tired eyes, and realized that fixing might not be the verb this house needed anymore. Morning returned with the kind of gray light that makes a kitchen look honest, and while the kettle rumbled and the toast popped like small punctuation marks at the edge of a paragraph I had been writing all my life without realizing it, I drafted the final move of a campaign that never announced itself as war, because revenge delivered with a clipboard can look suspiciously like repair, and repair, when you do it right, can sting the people who preferred the broken shape. So I assembled the pieces on my table with the deliberateness of someone laying out evidence at a hearing and tested the tone of what I would say, not to wound the people who had practiced wounding me with 1,000 paper cuts, but to hold up a mirror large enough that no one could step around it without admitting that avoidance is a choice. And then I opened my laptop to the shared album where the submissions had multiplied overnight into a tapestry of small specific kindnesses. Rides to school in the rain, casseroles with extra cheese after layoffs, scraped knees cleaned at a sink that always smelled a little like lemon, and I built, in under an hour, because clarity sometimes accelerates the hands, a public page that bore my grandmother's name at the top, and then a ledger of a different flavor underneath, 1 line per cousin and 1 line for me, each tied to the charitable gift they had chosen, each amount identical down to the spelled-out cents, each entry accompanied by a memory submitted by someone else, a small corrective to the one-voice narratives my aunt had curated like a gallery with a cover charge. Before I published anything, I drove to my grandmother's house with the framed childhood photo tucked under my arm and the pastel notebook in my bag, like a confiscated prop from a play that deserved a rewrite. And I sat with her at the kitchen table where the sun finally found us through the lace curtain and read aloud the names of the organizations our family had collectively chosen: food banks, scholarship funds, a shelter named after a woman who used to sit 2 pews ahead of us and wore hats like punctuation marks, and I watched her shoulders lift as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, and when I finished she asked me, in that gentle way she uses when she wants to grant permission without issuing an order, whether I felt ready to push the button that would make this real, and I told her that readiness was a generous word for what this felt like, but that I would rather be generous today than accurate in the old way, and she nodded and reached for my hand and told me to include her note at the top in her exact words, which I typed as she spoke. Fairness is love measured in the same spoon. The page went live at the same moment my aunt's car turned into the driveway, the wheels whispering their approach like a rumor that had decided to arrive with receipts, and when she stepped into the kitchen with a face arranged for a lecture and a folder pinched under her arm. I slid the laptop toward her so she could see that the new ledger required no gatekeeper, that the amounts were already transferred from my account with confirmations sent to each organization, that the comments beneath were beginning to fill with names of neighbors and church ladies and old school friends who recognized a relief when they saw one, and I told her, as gently as my voice could hold, that while the old ledger might still exist for the sake of archive, it would not be our family's accounting language anymore, and that she was welcome to join us in this new math where every line added up without the need to explain the tilt. Her mouth formed a series of shapes that did not produce words immediately, which is maybe the closest to listening I have ever seen her perform, and she finally said that I had made her look bad in front of people who admired her for keeping tradition alive. To which I answered that tradition is not a living thing if it feeds by taking from the quiet, and that I had not named her in any post and did not intend to, and if people recognized her in the mirror the page held up that was between them and their reflection. Then my phone began to shake itself across the table with messages from cousins whose names had been just lines to my aunt, but were now signatures on something cleaner, and my mother wrote me a message that started with please and ended with proud. And my grandfather's friend called to tell me the page had made him cry in his truck outside the hardware store, and would I tell my grandmother she had kept her promise after all. Because I believe in a revenge that leaves furniture intact and still manages to rearrange the room, I posted a final image to the album, a photograph of our hands. My grandmother's with its small blue rivers and my own with ink on the fingertips from flipping pages, resting on the pastel notebook now tied shut with a ribbon the color of apology, and I wrote a caption that said, "Archive closed, table open." And as soon as I did, a cousin I rarely hear from added a photo of his own children in paper crowns cut from grocery bags, with a line that read, "Same spoons," and if there was a moment when the house finally exhaled after holding its breath for too many years, it was that. My aunt did not apologize that morning, which I did not expect, but she did place the folder she had carried so tightly onto the table and slide it toward my grandmother without ceremony. And I opened it later to find a rough printout of a budget for a future party with a column labeled Fairness Audit and a note to herself that simply said no more adjustments, and while I could not decide whether to believe the page or the person, I chose to act as if both were sincere, not because forgiveness was owed, but because moving forward required fuel other than fury, and so I closed the laptop, poured coffee that had gone lukewarm in the victory, and watched my grandmother smile at the sunlight that had pushed its way to our side of the curtain. In the afternoon, I sat in my car outside the grocery store and read the comments on the page that argued, as comments will, about whether I had been petty or principled, whether making this public had been a service or a show, whether family matters should be aired or ironed, and I let the disagreement sit there like whether I did not need to fix, because the truth had already done its work, and when my aunt's name popped up on my phone with a message that said, "Next week I will bring envelopes for everyone," I stared at it for a long moment before replying that envelopes were not the point anymore, that we were measuring with spoons now, and that she was welcome at the table. And I hit send knowing full well that an invitation is not a guarantee, that people do not change in a day just because you redrafted the rules. And yet as I drove home with the radio low and the day beginning to fold into itself, I realized that winning had never been about a bag or a ledger or even a page on the internet, but about the quiet satisfaction of watching a story you did not write stop telling itself with your silence, and if the ending felt open. If there was still a question braided into the last line about whether I had restored something or started a burn that would keep the house warm and a little scarred, then perhaps that is how truth prefers to be served, with enough room left on the plate for doubt to sit and learn some manners.